Well, welcome back to part 4 of our series on Philippians. This is the fourth and final part, talking about the fourth and final chapter of Philippians. I really enjoyed the other parts. We've had Dear Church, Live for Christ. That was Andrew. Dear Church, Live with Humility. That was Martin. Dear Church, Live with Confidence. And that was Jonathan. And I've really enjoyed these, and to hear more of the context and the culture of the city of Philippi, and to consider Paul writing to it. This little 4-chapter letter that Paul wrote is nice and succinct and really lends itself to a series like this. If you haven't seen the other parts in this series, I'll put a link to them in this description. You can circle back and check them out. I recommend it. But now we're on to our fourth and final part in this series, Dear Church, Live in Peace. It's another great chapter, Philippians chapter 4. No doubt one you've heard it quoted a lot of times. Literally some of the most quoted portions in the entire Bible come out of this chapter. So let's get into it. He's starting his wrap up here. And don't forget, Paul wasn't writing a book. He was writing a letter. He's bringing it into land by starting with, therefore, Philippians chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, my brothers and sisters. I always like it when a speaker starts to give those little hints where they're like, I'll close with this, or to summarize. You don't need to budget too much more of your attention span. I'll try to respect yours today as we get into this, but Paul's summing up his letter. Therefore, those other 3 chapters, living for Christ and humility and confidence, and now therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, stand firm in the Lord. In this way, my dear friends. Isn't that lovely? Eugene Patterson, the author of The Message, describes Philippians in his introduction as Paul's happiest book. And you can kind of hear it bubbling up in the way he talks to his church here. He loves them, and he feels warmth and joy towards them. My joy and my crown, he calls them. It's like that feeling of being among your people, among your brothers and sisters who root for you and have your back. I mean, here's Paul in prison when he's writing this. Don't forget that. He's constantly guarded, so maybe constantly having to be on his guard. And when he thinks of the people in Philippi, it makes him rejoice. I think that's something that we should cultivate in one another. Let's scheme together as to how we can do that for one another, and how we can be that for one another. Now, on the flip side, we have these 2 sisters who you can't help but feel sorry for. I plead with Euodia and Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they've contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. These 2 sisters, Euodia and Syntyche, who seem to have a disagreement that's reached Paul's ear, and for 2,000 years, people like us have been reading about it. Can you imagine if for like 2,000 years Christians would read about a disagreement between Kevin and Jody, or between Kevin and Uncle Charlie? How mortifying. But what I like, Paul doesn't rebuke them or say, hey, you guys are bad, or who is right or who is wrong. Paul says, I plead with you to be of the same mind in the Lord. And then he highlights their service. The fact that he worked alongside them with this other sister named Clement, or maybe it's a brother, I'm not sure. But nothing but positive urging and reinforcement from Paul here. And I think there's a lesson there for us, don't you? He's not ignoring the disagreement. He's not shying away from talking about it, but he's bringing it up and urging harmony, and he's remembering and commending out loud the good times and the building together that these sisters did, and encouraging going forward. So, dear church, live in peace with each other. Now, at this point, Paul starts wrapping up his letter, and he's giving his final encouragement, his final takeaways, his exhortations. And they're not just empty, nice-sounding words, and we'll get to why in just a second. Rejoice in the Lord always. And I'll say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Now, when you see that verse, when you hear that verse, rejoice in the Lord always. Who do you think of that embodies that verse? When I hear that verse, rejoice in the Lord always, I always think of my brother Cam Ramage. I know it was a favorite of his. And he was someone like Paul who lived with good reason not to rejoice, but chose to. Rejoice in the Lord. And it's so important, I'm going to say it again. Rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. It's a fruit of the Spirit, after all, gentleness. And people should know you by your fruit. Gentleness means gentle strength. Not a wallflower, not meek. Gentle strength. Strength under God's control. What's the opposite of that? It's impulse. It's thoughtless reaction. It's force above situation. It's temper. And it's panic. And it's fear-driven action. The things we do that we're not proud of. The moments where we don't check ourselves. We can probably think of people who live in that space. We aren't called to that. We're called to the quiet confidence of relying on the strength of God. Gentleness. Dear church, live in peace with your own nature. Let your gentleness be evident to all. Okay, so now comes perhaps the most well-known verses in the chapter or epistle, or maybe a lot of epistles. Paul tells the church, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, this is a lovely verse. We should be a little bit careful of it, particularly when prescribing it for someone else. One thing that's talked about a bit now, and it's good to talk about, is the concept of toxic positivity. Toxic positivity happens when when people are walking through really hard times or dark times, and someone else tells them, "Oh, well, don't worry about it. Be positive. Don't think about it. Look at the blessings you have, and therefore you shouldn't be sad about anything, or you shouldn't be grieving anything because of the good things in your life and the blessings and the health or wealth or other family." And someone might say, oh, you have all these things, so therefore you can't or you shouldn't be sad, or it's an ungrateful thing for you to be sad or anxious. And I feel that this verse here can be abused in that way. Oh, don't be anxious about anything. Remember what it says in Philippians. Don't be anxious, implying that if you are anxious, you're doing Christianity wrong. So how can we take this verse? Well, first, remember who's saying it. It's Paul who's saying it. And he's currently a prisoner when he said this. And he's had this big list of things that have happened to him. And we can read about that elsewhere. Stoned, shipwrecked, imprisoned, whipped, beaten, outcast. People trying to kill him all the time. Always having to look over his shoulder. And now he's imprisoned. And a decree could come at any time for his release or his execution. Talk about anxiety causing. Neither outcome would be surprising. And he kind of says as much in chapter 1. He's like, well, if I die, well, for me to die is gain. In terms of life experience, Paul has the bank account to write the check prescribing a verse like this. Okay, that might not be the best metaphor, but you know what I mean. I mean, if verses like these are ever something we're going to be saying to someone else, we want to make sure that we have the cash in the bank for that. We're not sitting in a place of privilege and just saying to someone else, hey, don't be anxious about anything, just pray about it. Don't you know that God's there and he listens to you? Hey, you're grieving? Don't be anxious, don't be sad about that. don't you know you can pray and the person that you're missing is in heaven and therefore you shouldn't be sad? That's toxic positivity. And that's something for me as a Christian to be aware of, to be careful of. Now for Paul walked the hard road. And he had the credibility to say, well, here's what I found to help. And this is where Paul lives. He's saying that, this is what I've held on to while I was on that road. And Paul says, I've learned to be content. Let's jump a bit in the chapter. I've learned the secret of being content I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Paul is able to encourage them with his contentment. You'd think it would be the other way around, like Paul's the one in prison. Have you ever visited someone in a dark place, a place of trial, and they're content and they're blessed? Maybe it's some of their last days on earth and they're encouraging you with their inner contentment. Paul had that blessing. And he had this conclusion: I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Or the King James translation says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, this is a verse that sometimes people put by itself and interpret it to mean whatever I determine to accomplish in my life, I can because Christ will strengthen me. That's a nice idea. But what Paul was actually saying in this context was Paul was able to endure all things, good or bad, with contentment. And that is a secret strength, a secret superpower, a beautiful gift that I've seen again and again in my brothers and my sisters. In every sort of situation. It's a great testimony. And the peace that they have in all circumstance, a peace that passes all understanding. Doesn't make sense. Passes all understanding. Doesn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. And there it is, guarding their hearts, no matter where their paths take them. It's an awesome blessing and a testimony. The peace that passes all understanding will guard your hearts as a side effect of trusting in our Father. Dear church, live in peace. It's less of an imperative and more of an invitation to enjoy it. We've talked about peace with one another. We've talked about peace with our nature. We've talked about peace in trying circumstance. The peace of God that passes all understanding. But in each of these, it's not from people who are specifically going out to seek peace. We're told to seek other things, and the peace will be a natural side effect. Rejoice in the Lord always. Let your gentleness be evident to all. Do not be anxious about anything, with prayer and supplication. And, there's the equals side of that equation, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus. These things go in, peace comes out. And over here, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever's true, whatever's noble, whatever's right, whatever's pure, whatever's lovely, whatever's admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things. Whatever you've learned or received from me or seen in me, put it into practice. And the God of peace will be with you. Another equation here. Think about these things, put into practice, and the and's the equal sign over here. The God of peace will be with you. It's no accident that Paul chooses this name for God, God of peace, in this passage. Dear church, live in peace. It's an invitation to enjoy it. Peace with one another, peace with your nature, peace within trying circumstance. The peace of God which passes all understanding. Let's meditate on this gift from our Father, and let's rest in it. Okay. God bless you all.